the worst. Trust me, we've been there before. But lots of folks are excited about getting this recording. And just for everyone tuning in here, we will be sending this out to you later in an email. So if you can't stick around for the whole thing, or if you're listening to this recording later, then you know we sent it out via email. How about that? All right, so welcome back everyone to the SheJumps Alpine Development School. My name is Claire Smallwood. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of SheJumps, and I would like to take a moment to thank Arc'teryx for their awesome continued support of this program. We've hosted many wonderful events at Arc'teryx stores around the US and Canada, and specifically their retail store managers all make a really strong personal commitment to impact local communities. So we really couldn't do this without Arc'teryx's support. So thank you so much, Arc'teryx. Also like to give a big shout out to Gaia GPS as a token of appreciation for signing up for this course. Gaia GPS is offering all participants a 3-month free trial for premium membership. So that's pretty exciting. You'll receive a link to activate that free trial in a follow-up email with the recording for the event. So for some of you, this might be your first SheJumps event. If you came last night, maybe it's your second SheJumps event, or I know we've got some core fans in the audience as well. So anyway, so great to have you all here. For those of you who are new to SheJumps, we're a nonprofit organization started by Lindsay Dyer, Vanessa Pierce, and myself way back in 2007. We rallied around the idea of if she can do it, so can I. And this vision has grown into a national nonprofit that produces more than 150 programs and events each year, serving more than 6,000 participants. Our mission is to increase the participation of women and girls in outdoor activities. And many of our events focus on building foundational outdoor skills. So not just getting into the backcountry and getting rad, but lots of basic stuff too. So our programs start at age 6 and they go up from there. So this photo is from our Alpine Finishing School course. So that's kind of the original program that kind of spawned the idea for this Alpine Development School. It's where I met Christine, our lovely guide for the evening. And this course is a 7-day ski and splitboard mountaineering course held outside of Revelstoke, British Columbia at the Selkirk Lodge. However, it's not exactly the most accessible course because, hey, you have to get to Revelstoke, you have to get in a helicopter, and you have to be able to spend 7 days on a glacier. All wonderful things, but very expensive, and we recognize that. So the Alpine Development School is part of our community to create progression events that build those baseline skill sets for a lifetime of adventuring. By purchasing your ticket for this event, you're helping SheJumps provide transformational outdoor play for women and girls everywhere, regardless of background or ability. It's really important to us. We offer a lot of other great online events related to staying safe in the backcountry, from our trail prep series to avalanche courses ranging from backcountry 101 to certification courses, mostly in the States. I want to throw that out there. I know we have some international participants here, but we also obviously have these online events too. So that means anybody anywhere can join these. So in addition to those technical skills trainings, we have conversational events, and we also have a great group of regional Facebook groups where you can connect with our community. So I know last night we had a lot of questions about how to find people to go ski touring with, and those regional Facebook groups are the spot to go for that. In the follow-up email, as I mentioned, we'll share the recording and some other links to specific events you might enjoy. So head on over to shejumps.org/events if you ever want to know what's going on, if something's happening in your area. So now is the part where I get to gush about Christine because she's the best. And I'm so excited that she's our guide for this event. I've known Christine for actually quite a few years now. I think we met in 2014 at the Alpine Finishing School. And she's based in Squamish, BC, but originally from Canmore, Alberta. And Christine's co-guided the Alpine Finishing School on at least 4 separate occasions that we can remember, but I swear it was more than that.
It might have been. I can't remember either.
We can't remember. We just have so much fun. We just all blurs into one, which is so great. Over the years, I've come to know Christine as one of the most knowledgeable, passionate, and patient people I've ever met. And these skills are super important in big mountain terrain. As one fellow ACMG splitboard guide, Joey Vosberg, says, Christine humbly possesses the skills that most splitboarders or skiers would kill to have, and her calm demeanor and warm personality is reflected in her approach to the mountains. I certainly hope you all gather that from her tonight, because I have learned so much from her over the years, and I'm really excited to share this with our community. Christine's the first and only female to hold an ACMG certification on a snowboard, having passed the apprentice ski guide exams on a splitboard. And right now she's currently preparing to take her full ACMG ski guide course exam in the next few weeks. So if you'd like to book Christine for this winter, I strongly recommend it. Sorry, Americans, you'll have to wait until next year when the border opens. But you can hit her up through Altus Mountain Guides or Extremely Canadian in Whistler. And basically, as we go through this presentation, use the question and answer tool. When the questions come to you, write them down, and then we will have Christine answer the questions after the presentation. We should have plenty of time for questions. But yeah, so basically learn more about SheJumps. Please check out our website, follow us on social media. We have one more of these courses tomorrow. So sign up if you haven't already. It's about building your process or process. I do live in Canada. I am learning how to say it correctly. Anyway, you must register separately for those events, and we'll include the link in the follow-up. So if you didn't know about it already, now you know about it for tomorrow. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Christine and enjoy the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Claire. Welcome back, everybody. And those of you who are new, welcome to the presentation tonight. Yesterday evening, we marked our first of 3 sessions, and we defined what a hazard is and what is a risk and how we can begin to manage these factors. Tonight, we also talked about decision making and how pre-planning will help us make better decisions in the field. And we outlined common hazards and hazardous attitudes that we need to watch out for. And lastly, we reminded that, like in all aspects in life, the ability to communicate openly and honestly with our peers will lead to our success. This evening, our session is going to delve into how terrain can be used as our best defense. We're going to discover how uncertainty and fear can be diminished with a good understanding of how snow will behave in relation to the terrain. So how certain avalanche problems can be heightened by terrain, and how different elevations within that terrain are often associated with specific avalanche problems. It is important to remember that there are no hard and fast rules in the backcountry environment. It always depends, which can be very frustrating sometimes. But the more we know and plan for the better, the more we know and plan for, the better prepared we will be. Fundamentals of winter backcountry travel suggest that taking an avalanche course, developing a good understanding of snow science, snowpack tests, how weather relates to the snowpack, and so on are going to be crucial to safety. But the reality is the snowpack is not something you can assess with absolute certainty. With the snowpack, there is always going to be a degree of uncertainty, and this is where terrain selection comes in. Terrain can increase your certainty when it comes to staying safe in avalanche territory. We do this by applying terrain knowledge and appropriate terrain selection in combination with what we do and don't know about the snowpack on a given day. This is going to increase our chances of staying safe in the mountains. I know when I first started backcountry touring, there were days when I was almost frozen from uncertainty. Where to go? How was I going to stay safe? Am I afraid for real? Or is it just because I don't know something? And I would like to spend a minute to talk about levels of uncertainty as they relate to snowpack and terrain selection. So there are days in the mountains when our level of uncertainty regarding the strength of the snowpack is relatively high. For example, when we're in the middle of a good melt freeze cycle in the spring, we can be pretty certain that the snowpack is going to be relatively stable, at least while it's still frozen. On the other hand, when we're in the middle of a big storm cycle, we can be pretty certain that the snowpack is relatively unstable. So during times of higher certainty surrounding the snowpack, it's going to be easy for us to make more confident terrain choices. People often choose to tackle bigger and more complex objectives during a good melt freeze cycle in the spring. And on the flip side, people often stay home or choose very simple terrain on stormy days when the chances for avalanches are high. Where it gets tricky is when our uncertainty is high. So realistically, this is actually the kind of thing we deal with most of the days of the season. We have more uncertainty with regard to the strength of the snowpack. We're going to need to hedge our bets by choosing appropriate terrain. So this is not necessarily a case of being uncertain because we are inexperienced, though these two things often go hand in hand. But professionals will often tell you that there are many days in a winter season when we are dealing with a high degree of uncertainty in the snowpack. And to deal with this, we choose terrain with smaller consequences or lower likelihood of producing avalanches, even when the avalanche hazard is sitting at moderate or low. So if you're unsure of what you're dealing with, dial it back. An example of this is when we deal with something called a persistent weak layer buried in the snowpack. Typically speaking, when we have a persistent weak layer, it gets first buried, there's going to be an avalanche cycle. Always think about how snow does not like a quick change. After this initial avalanche cycle, avalanche activity tends to taper off. But unlike with, say, storm slab avalanches, there will likely be more avalanche activity that persists for some time after the weak layer gets buried. These avalanches are going to become less and less frequent and more difficult to predict as time goes on, and the layers get buried deeper and deeper into the snowpack. And as they're buried farther down, the consequences start to get higher as the destructive potential of these avalanches increases. So in times like this, you're going to hear professionals talk about high levels of uncertainty, and you'll also likely read in your avalanche bulletins, low hazard, high consequence avalanches. You want to look out for this wording. This is where terrain selection can really come into play. Choosing the terrain that is appropriate to both the conditions that you are seeing and your level of uncertainty takes a lot of practice. So I want to urge you to actively participate in this learning process and to not blindly follow people around in the mountains on the assumption that they know what they are doing. The truth is, none of us really actually know what the outcome of the day will be, not even the professionals. The professionals are just better based off of experience at hedging their bets and stacking the odds in their favor. So if we can't be certain about snow, we can rely on terrain to be the constant. It is one of the most important things to understand if you want to stay safe in the backcountry. At a glance, it's going to seem easy to define terrain shapes. In reality, it's a lifelong journey to really hone our terrain assessment skills, and it requires us to reflect on our own actions and habits. To do this, it's helpful for us to have a cheat sheet. So we're going to spend the next bit of time here identifying the basic terrain shapes and features that we deal with when we go backcountry skiing or riding. And by classifying each feature, we can more easily see how they affect our route finding decisions. And then we can combine this information to formulate a basic strategy for approaching unfamiliar terrain based on its terrain type and help us when we're dealing with uncertainty. So having a strategy or a based approach to terrain is going to develop confidence when we approach unfamiliar areas. There's a saying out there that terrain repeats itself. So once you understand the terrain in your immediate area, you can often assume that similar patterns will arise around the next corner or on similar aspects. Having a strategy will also help you avoid complacency in familiar areas. And this goes back to that human factor called familiarity. So don't get caught off guard when the storms blow in from a different direction. You want to always be observing and basing your decisions on what is in front of you, not that you always go this way. Strategy is also going to help you reduce stress on yourself in new situations. So when we have rules regarding terrain shapes, we can rely on these rules if we're uncertain. And it's also going to help us work on an ongoing process of refinement and reflection. And this is how we grow ultimately. So don't assume your day was a success just because you made it home. Ask yourself, did you get lucky today? Could we have made a better decision somewhere? Did it work today? But maybe that decision would not work every time if we go there. And where were you most at risk? Could you have done anything different, or was the risk well managed? Okay. So when we look at terrain, there are, again, common shapes that the landscape takes that we can use to our advantage. There are shapes that are more likely to cause an avalanche, and there are shapes that are going to help offer us protection. And shapes which often have differing snowpack problems based on their aspect or exposure to elements. So the main slope shapes that we're going to talk about are convex, concave, planar, benches, ribs, gullies, and ridge crests. Convexities. So when we talk about a convex feature, we mean a slope that rolls over like a basketball. We often refer to these features as unsupported, and this means there is nothing supporting the terrain feature from below. This includes things such as cliffs. Convex rolls have increased slope stress and tension in the snowpack, making them likely places for an avalanche to initiate, especially at the point where the slope begins to kind of roll over. Before the angle steepens, gravity is going to press the snow straight down into the slope. And as the angle increases or rolls over, There's no longer anything to support the slope, and gravity is now pulling the snow instead of pressing. This invisible line is the area of tension or stress and is the most likely place to initiate an avalanche. This makes convexities difficult and dangerous to traverse and do not typically provide us with easier, safe track setting options. When we try to assess the snow conditions on a convex roll, often you'll find yourself already in a committed position once you're on slope by the time you reach the stress point. And due to the change in angle at a convexity, they can often have different snow conditions, as there may be different levels of exposure to things like wind and sun, which will increase the chances of you initiating an avalanche as you roll over that convex feature. When we look at this picture here, we see many deep shadows. Sometimes shadows are going to help offer us clues as where this unsupported terrain may be. If we look at the top center of the ridgeline, we can see that a slab avalanche was triggered, breaking right over the roll at the ridge, right at the convexity. This avalanche may have been natural or human triggered, but I know that this is an area I go to often, and it's a common spot to see slabs pull out here. The wind generally kind of deposits snow and builds the feature, and when the right trigger comes along, we end up with an avalanche. So generally speaking, it's a good strategy to avoid large convex features, especially when we're track setting. That's when we're going to be the most vulnerable in the terrain. A rule of thumb to remember is if you can't see over it, don't ski over it. And sometimes we may choose to ski over a convex roll because we're looking for fun lines to ski. But if you do choose to do something like this, you have to be aware that the terrain is essentially offering you no protection from weaknesses in the snowpack. And this is especially dangerous if the snow has slab properties to it. So a slab property, again, is snow that wants to stick together, and it's not going to just slough away loosely. It's going to stick together and come out as one full piece. So instead, try to look for alternative routes wherever possible. From this photo, we can see a more supported line to the skier's right of where the avalanche that is circled in the photo is. This terrain feature offers us protection due to the shape, and it's what we would call supported. So you can see that pink line coming down there. Of course, the size of the feature plays a big role in our terrain selection. Large convex features can have high consequences if an avalanche is triggered, but very small convexities can be great indicators for snow stability and a great place to assess storm snow instabilities with very low consequence. So often when I head out track setting, I'll look for very tiny convex features that I can cut across that tension line while I'm putting my track in and see if I can gain any information. How easy is it for me to trigger a little slab? Is there a slab property in the snow? And again, is this representative of the area I'm heading to, or is this have nothing to do with where I'm heading? Remember though, when levels of uncertainty are high, again, it's going to be wise for us to avoid all large convex features. So our next terrain shape that we're going to talk about here is concavities. So concave features are slopes that are more dish-shaped. Think of the common playground slide shape, and we commonly refer to these features as supported. Concave features tend to have less stress and tension in the snowpack than convex, as gravity is pressing the snow into the slope. It's important to be cautious where the concave feature begins. However, the top transition into a concave feature can sometimes be convex. Often, concave features are the runout zones for avalanches as well. And as the slope angle decreases, avalanche debris can pile up and act as a terrain trap in these areas. So this is going to increase your consequences of being in an avalanche. Again, due to the change in shape, concave features may create altering snow conditions due to the exposure to sun and wind, and we should always be on the lookout for a change in snow conditions. So often we like to talk about slope shape as either supported or unsupported, and we look for the supported terrain to go up and down. Generally speaking, concave features provide easier and safer terrain for track setting, and they tend to be considered supported terrain features and can be good places to aim for when we try to travel in avalanche terrain going up or down. But it is important to remember that these slope shapes often go together and can happen anywhere. And again, that in the wrong place, a concave feature can act as a terrain trap. Okay, so next we have planar slopes. A planar slope is a slope that is basically featureless in the sense that it is all one angle. Because of this, the potential exists for large slope propagation. So that means that we could have an avalanche cross the entire slope. Large planar slopes must be assessed carefully if you're going to go up or down them because of this. These featureless slopes help provide easy track setting as you do not have to navigate around convexities or through gullies or be confined to terrain features like a ridge. Um, and you can use this to your advantage if you look for bite-sized pieces of terrain that can be easily managed. And this also goes for the way down. So if I am going to engage with a planar slope, I'm looking for smaller planar slopes that give me the chance to manage it effectively with the people that I'm with and not just be out on a big slope for a long period of time. As with any terrain feature, planar slopes as with any terrain feature, our strategy for planar slopes should be partly based on the size and slope angle associated with that slope. But a few things can be said about them in general terms. So a large planar slope that is steep enough to avalanche can be a terrifying place to find yourself. If you trigger a slab avalanche, it has the potential to go wall to wall as there's nothing to break up that terrain feature. The size and angle of a planar slope is key when you decide whether or not you're going to travel on it. Okay, moving into benches. So benches are any shallower angle portion of terrain above, below, or in the middle of a slope. They tend to dissipate stress and tension in the snowpack as they provide a break in the angle of the slope. So benches often provide the least amount of resistance to traverse, and therefore they're going to help you track set more efficiently. They can also be a nice place to cross a slope on the up or on the down, but they can be deceptively steep. And in that case, they're not going to make for good track setting at all. And while we like to often use benches as roadways, there may be hazards above and below them. So if you're stopping on a bench or using it to cross terrain, consider how wide the bench is and how far from the slope above you you are able to be. And while large benches may provide safety from avalanche terrain, this is not going to always be the case. They can also act as a terrain trap, an area where you're going to, again, increase your consequences of being in an avalanche because of the lower angle. You can then have more avalanche debris pile up in that piece of terrain. But benches define the grain of the terrain. So when you start to analyze terrain, you'll notice that most of the time, the benches in a given area are all going to kind of slope in the same direction. If you recognize this, you can use the terrain to your advantage when setting your skin track and connect bench after bench to easily work up something on that first, work yourself up the mountain on maybe what something looks first to be impossible to get through. If you don't recognize this, you're going to be fighting against the grain, which will make you feel like you're fighting the terrain the whole way up. The safety and ease of travel on benches will really depend again on the size, shape, and steepness of the slope above and below them, and the size and steepness of the bench that you're using to travel on as well. So in this photo, benches were used to traverse terrain while moving downhill, connecting areas of safety and good skiing. And we're actually on a glacier here too, so we're using the benches to kind of move ourselves either around crevasses and through that terrain as we move downhill. Okay, so moving into ribs. So a rib is a vertical ridge that runs down a slope. They tend to confine your track setting, especially as you get higher up the rib feature, which forces the terrain to become narrow. This results in more effort and less efficiency while you're skinning, especially if you end up having to do lots of kick turns or perhaps even switch to a boot pack. They're going to create cross slope tension due to changes in snow depth resulting from changes in aspect, which will have effects with weather, wind, sun, solar, that kind of stuff. A change in aspect can be associated with different solar exposure and wind exposure, as I just said, which will lead to one side being scoured while the other side is wind loaded. Wind loading on one side of a rib is known as cross loading and can be tricky when dealing with avalanche conditions. They kind of create tricky avalanche conditions because you may not expect as much loading to be happening on one side versus the other. And but by staying on the rib, they can offer you protection from avalanches by providing a barrier to cross slope propagation. However, with the right avalanche problem, like a stiff slab, this may not hold true, and that slab could potentially run through that terrain feature if it's not big enough. So the pros and cons of ribs are going to again depend on the size, slope angle, and steepness that are associated with them. And narrow and steeper ribs will probably provide less safety and be more difficult to travel on, especially when you're track setting, than maybe a wider, lower angled rib is going to allow you to do. Okay, moving into gullies. So a gully is the opposite of a ridge. It's a water or drainage feature. They can be difficult to exit once you're in them, and they often confine track setting due to the sidewalls that end up, especially as you move farther down the mountains, the sidewalls tend to get higher and higher. They funnel avalanche debris or slough, and similar to ribs, they create cross-loading features, and they act again as a terrain trap here. So they're not a great place to hang out. Gullies are often best avoided, generally speaking. As with any terrain feature, this is going to again depend on the size and steepness of the gully, but committing yourself to skiing down an unfamiliar gully is not a great strategy, especially if your map reading skills are not fine-tuned. If you commit to a gully that is wide and mellow up high, as you go down mountain, you may find that the sidewalls are going to become larger and steeper as you descend, which will make it harder for you to exit that gully and make it more dangerous because now you're kind of trapped in this terrain feature. So due to their confining nature, they tend not to be very easy or safe track setting options. And again, because of their confining nature, they're a terrain trap, and they definitely funnel avalanche debris down the guts of gullies. So if you had a big enough avalanche and you're at the bottom of this gully, you're putting yourself in a really dangerous position without any escape route. As you climb higher and higher in the gully, maybe it gets easier to get out of, maybe not, but it's definitely a feature that you don't want to spend much time in if you can avoid it. Okay. So we have a couple more to go through, but I just wanted to quickly talk about propagation potential. So when making decisions about terrain, you wanted to consider the propagation potential of an avalanche. So this is directly related to the type of avalanche problem you're dealing with. You want to watch out for things such as wind slab and deep or persistent slab problems such as facets and surface hoar, as they have the potential to link terrain when they avalanche. So don't underestimate storm slab either, or a wet slab avalanche, because in certain conditions, they can also do the same. Propagation potential is how far or wide the crown of a slab avalanche is going to travel across a slope. So to understand this, we need to understand tension within a snowpack, or how well bonded the snow is, as the bonds between individual grains are what help keep our snowpack together. Snow crystals bond better when they are small and rounded in shape versus big and sharp. Essentially, this is friction holding one layer to another. As weight is added to the snowpack, it's going to start to stretch the snow. If the bonds are strong, gravity and weight will not overcome the friction or resistance between those bonds. But the tension in the snowpack can be affected by three factors: the increase or decrease of bonds within the snow, which can be affected by pressure or temperature; localized weaknesses such as persistent weak layers in the snow; and then the added weight from more snow, rain, heat, cornice falls, avalanches, or humans. When we speak of propagation potential and cross slope tension, we're talking about two things here. So how strong is the bond within a slab, and how strong is the bond of that slab to the layer beneath it? A stiff or well-bonded slab has a large propagation potential once it gets moving. For example, When we're looking at a rib slope, there is potential for cross-loading on the slope, which means snow will be thicker in some places and thinner in others. Weak layers beneath the snow are going to be easier to trigger where the snowpack is thinner, and this creates cross-slope potential when combined with a stiff slab, which means an avalanche is able to link across a terrain feature. Cool. So we'll continue on with the last of our terrain features here, which is a ridge crest. This is not exactly a basic terrain shape, but it's still worth mentioning. Ridge crests are the height of land feature where there's no more terrain above you. This does not mean that you're necessarily on the summit, but rather that the terrain descends on either side of the feature. Ridge crests often lead to summits, and we tend to gravitate towards ridge crests as they can offer protection from avalanches as there's no terrain above you, and they can be great vantage points and are often a destination in themselves. Keep in mind here that ridge crests are the kind of places where cornices like to form, and they may also be the kind of places where the snowpack transitions from deep to shallow, which may mean that a person could trigger an avalanche more easily from one of the shallow snowpack zones. They also tend to have both a lee and windward side, as well as a side that is more sun exposed. So the snow conditions on either side of a ridge can vary greatly. So when traveling on a corniced ridge, be sure to give cornices a wide berth as they can pull back they can pull back into the terrain a long way if they do happen to fail. Remember that the ridgeline might not be as straight as you think. It could kind of be more serrated, and the gaps hiding under the snow or the cornice won't be as visible. So it's a good idea in this situation to kind of have your probe out when you're dealing with cornices to ensure that you're well away from the edge and you know where that ground is. Okay. So we're going to move now into elevation bands. So within terrain as a whole, we travel through 3 different elevation bands. Each of these bands is associated with their own characteristics that can aid or inhibit our safety. It's important to read the avalanche bulletin to understand both the hazard rating and avalanche problems that are going to be associated with each of these elevation bands. And we tend to list, or not that we tend to, but we list the elevation bands as below tree line, and alpine. This can help us pre-plan terrain that will be appropriate for the day, or perhaps places we want to avoid completely. Recognize that each elevation band has some unique attributes that require certain risk management strategies. Okay, so elevation bands are not set at a certain elevation footage. They are recognizable by their character instead. So below tree line is in the forest. I like to think of this as the place where maybe you could easily hide 100 people. However, there are places below tree line where you can be exposed to avalanche problems from higher elevations, such as a slide path that runs from top to bottom, or an open cut block like we have here in BC. Often we hang out below tree line when avalanche conditions are higher, and the tree skiing can be really fun, especially on a stormy day when the skiing is good and the visibility is poor up high where we have no trees to help us see. But the common mistake people like to make is to overestimate the protection that trees provide us from avalanches. In order for trees to have any real anchoring effect on the snowpack, they need to be so tightly spaced that we wouldn't actually be able to ski or ride through them. So if the trees are open enough to ski through, they are open enough to avalanche. One of the real reasons why skiing in the trees may be safer than when we ski up high during a storm is because the trees are offering us protection from the wind. So it may be that there are slabs forming at higher elevations while the snow remains low density in the trees. Keep in mind that treat areas often are the kinds of places where surface hoar crystals tend to form, and they can be well preserved due to this shelter from the wind. So places to be extra cautious are openings in the trees or thinly spaced trees, such as in avalanche paths, cut blocks, or meadows. So for example, during a storm when a layer of surface hoar gets buried, this could be an instance when skiing in the trees can be more dangerous than skiing at higher elevations, as the trees will protect the surface hoar from damage or being knocked over by the wind. This is the kind of information that you want to try to search out when you're reading through avalanche bulletins. And you might find it listed as higher hazard below tree line tree line with lower hazard up in the Alpine, which is not normally the way we see things when we're looking at the avalanche bulletin. And while not avalanche related, navigating in the trees and keeping your group together is another risk management consideration when traveling through this elevation band. So when we go travel uphill or down, we want to try to maintain visual contact with major terrain features, which can help us navigate through that terrain if we can't see anything else. Things like following a rib or a shoulder that is easily identifiable on your map. We call this kind of using it as a handrail, can be a great way to help you navigate again in that kind of green out terrain. When you're skiing downhill, or if you're spreading out um, while you're walking up, you want to regroup in large openings. And especially on the down, we really want to maintain communication in the trees. So making lots of noise is a good strategy when it comes to keeping the group together. um, and maybe talk about this before you actually start skiing downhill. Communicate early in the day with your group about how you're going to manage the tree skiing can be super crucial in keeping you guys together. You want to establish your strategy before you begin your descent. Remember that in this case, you're going to be your best rescue. And if people are hard to see, communicate with, or locate, rescuing or responding to emergency is going to be a lot harder. And tree wells are a big concern when we're skiing in the trees. So being able to always be in communication with your tree buddy is super important. So an example of how I would manage going down the skiing down in the trees is I would pick a designated leader. So if I'm the leader, I'm going to have the rest of the group keep my track in sight and ski with buddies. I'm going to ski kind of shorter pitches, and I'm going to continually be calling out or making noise. And if I can't hear my ski buddy behind me, I'm going to stop and see what's going on. During periods of deep snow, this is especially important for members. You really don't want to lose contact with that group or have people too spread out. So that calling back and forth can be really important. Again, tree wells are very serious. It's as serious as an avalanche, as well as just snow immersion in super deep snow. So again, being visually or voice contact with your group is super important. Okay, our next elevation band that we're going to talk about is tree line. So tree line terrain needs to be recognized as a transition area. You're now moving from dense forest into more open terrain, and you're closer to the major start zones, which are up in the Alpine. As you merge out of the trees and into more sparsely treed tree line elevation band, you want to be on the lookout for changes in conditions. One of the most important changes is watching for wind effect. It is likely that this elevation band has seen more wind than below tree line, which can result in wind-loaded areas, wind-scoured areas, and wind slabs. Another condition to be on the lookout for is the solar effect. And the snow at tree line is typically more exposed to the sun than the snow in the trees. So you could have crusts forming here, or just like sticky snow that you weren't expecting or something like that. Tree line terrain can be some of the easiest terrain to navigate, though, due to the fact that the visibility is less restricted than in dense trees. And in poor weather, you're less likely to experience true whiteout conditions because the trees are going to help provide some visual reference as you're moving through that terrain. Alpine terrain is the terrain above tree line. So here we have no more trees, and the terrain is in general gains in complexity and is the most exposed to the elements. In some ways, it's the easiest place to navigate in, as visibility is generally unrestricted and you can kind of see everywhere. But that being said, if the weather changes, whiteout conditions can move in super quickly and you can find yourself having no clue where you are. And navigating in a whiteout is something that takes a lot of skill and practice. So choosing to go into the alpine terrain on a day when the weather is likely to change is not a very good strategy if you don't have the skills required to navigate a whiteout. Especially because now you're in the alpine where you'll find your more complex hazards such as cornices and glaciers, and you tend to be exposed to the big start zones here. So you could just be more likely to trigger an avalanche in these zones. Cool. So in closing, to summarize terrain, I can't stress enough that oh man, tongue-tied today. I can't stress enough that understanding terrain and its relationship to hazards is the most important piece of the puzzle when you're navigating through the mountains. Practicing this skill involves pre-planning. When you read the avalanche bulletin, start to prepare a list of terrain you would expect to find the hazard associated with that day. Always be looking at and analyzing terrain on both a micro and macro scale, and try to keep your head up and your eyes open. It can be easy to get chatting and just following along and not paying attention, but it is your responsibility to pay attention and improve your skills and knowledge, which you must actively work on. Terrain repeats itself. So once you understand the terrain you are faced with, it is easy to develop a strategy to deal with that location. Okay. So we're going to move into our question portion of the evening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christine. That was great. This is the voice of Claire. That's what you're hearing. Okay, so we did have a request for some more terrain photos, and I dug some up that
cool.
maybe we could take a quick peek at, just to maybe you could even just, I mean, I know that this is like very guides exam-ish to like make you do this on the fly. But I've got them pulled up right here. They're stuff that Kate Devine, who helped create the Alpine Finishing School with me, that she had sent. And I can just do a quick screen share, and maybe you could just like point out some features, because some folks were saying like, oh, just like would love some more examples of some of these things. There's just a couple. Would you be?
Sure.
There we go. Here we go.
So I stopped sharing mine.
Yes, I will.
Okay, I'll stop sharing. You're on.
Okay. Awesome. Here we go. 3, 2, 1.
Action.
Where is it? It's taking its time. It says it's trying. I gave it too many commands at once. But we do have great. Can you see that actually on my screen?
I can't see anything yet.
Okay, well, here we go. Preview. Desktop 1. One of these two has got to work.
Okay. Yeah, there we go.
Seeing some terrain?
I'm seeing some terrain.
Okay, so she has this as, avalanche. And again, like just kind of freestyle this. We don't have to go through it like in depth, but just kind of this obviously alpine and tree line transition avalanche paths. So like if you can pull through like ribs or benches or any of those other features that you chatted about.
Sure.
Yeah, there's a couple good ones in here.
Okay. So can you guys, like if I move my mouse around, can you see that on there?
No, unfortunately not. But
okay. Okay. Okay, so how can we do this then? So if we're looking at the photo, lookers left of the photo, bottom corner, we see some open spots in the trees here that are not avalanche paths. These are what we would consider cut blocks. So in British Columbia, this happens a lot for us, where we have loggers come in, providing us great access to the backcountry and creating these swaths of unforested terrain below tree line that is a common place for surface hoar to grow, which is one of those persistent weed clares that we're often watching out for. And then if we kind of look from, there's like a lower cut block and then a middle cut block just above that lowest one. And then to the lookers right, we start seeing these avalanche paths coming down from this big face above. And so the ridge crest is obviously kind of the top crest of the of the mountain here. And then if we were to come down on the far looker's left, there's the main avalanche path that's close to the cut block. So as we come down here, just kind of where there's sun shining mid-slope in that cut block, there's kind of a break in terrain. So this would be, and there's another one just above that sunshine spot where the trees kind of thin out. These would be benches in the terrain that are very obvious benches. Not all benches are as obvious as this. Sometimes they're a lot more subtle than this. Let's see if we can pick out a photo that's a little more close.
Yeah, there we go.
Cool,
so this one has a lot going on in it.
Yeah, this has some great terrain features. So some things we didn't actually talk about are moraine features, but these are ridge features as well, or rib features, I should say. So we've got one, yeah, Claire's circling it there. So this is again kind of a sharp piece of terrain that has a high point on either side and then slopes away from that high point. And moraine features, like ribs, will have a lee side and a windward side. But it's also important to note that they are like almost always the perfect avalanche slope angle. So if you try to get on this moraine mid slope or mid moraine, you could be putting yourself in a lot more danger than if you were to get on it from the toe or the top of that feature. And then if we look kind of straight up from the moraine into the big face up high here, we have all these little ribs running down the face. And between each rib is going to be a small gully feature as they come down. And this is going to be really steep, extreme terrain. But just then looking either to the left or right of that face near the top of the ridges, you can kind of see convexities here, these like pillow-like shapes at the top of the ridge that all of a sudden get really steep underneath with deep shadow. So that would be some pretty obvious convex features um, that you'd want to be careful about if you're going to try to ski through some of that.
We've got another really good one for convex
Oh,
rolls
perfect.
right
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, so we're in again some glaciated terrain here. We can see some kind of sags in the terrain, but we also can see some convexities in this terrain. So right at the top of this ridge, going over these cliff bands, we've got quite a nice obvious convex feature, and then you can pick out the um, the ski lines where they've this is looks like maybe heli ski terrain, so they've probably done a pretty good job of trying to avoid convexities and use benches. So there's this bench kind of 3/4 of the way up the slope to move across, and then again avoid a convex feature, and move over to the looker's right of the slope and ski down here.
And you can see those looks like some up tracks or
Yeah,
those
okay, so
yeah,
maybe,
something. Yeah,
yeah,
maybe.
up tracks or down tracks. I can't quite tell.
Okay, we'll just do one more and then we'll roll it over to questions.
Okay,
Let me
sounds good.
pull a good one here. So this actually, I know that these are a lot quite glaciated stuff, but this one shows like some alpine entry level.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, this looks familiar.
It does look familiar. This is where we host the Alpine Finishing School. Don't you want to come ski it?
Yeah. So at the bottom here, we can see the tree line where we're still getting the speckled trees pushing up into the alpine features. At the very top, there's kind of top right, there's some ski lines coming down what we would call a planar slope. So a fairly large planar slope, but manageable. The slope angle here from this photo makes it look not super crazy. And there's no features on this slope. So that's what we talk about when we talk about a planar slope. Then as we move down that terrain, we can see all these bumps and rolls, convex features, and we can kind of see as well benches moving through the terrain here. And we can maybe even pick out more supported lines versus more unsupported lines that we could move down and through.
Yeah, and then there's also these features if you want to chat about like kind of some of those little mini
Yeah,
ribs,
the mini
I guess.
ribs and stuff in there. Yeah, good point. Thanks, Claire. So, yeah, down here in the tree line, we can see the deep shadows. So this is showing us that we've got kind of um, a rib in the terrain. And so um, these are mini features again. So you may be able to manage these. You may use them to come up or down. But if you were to just try to maybe walk up one of these little ridge features, you're going to find that you're having to do a million switchbacks probably in that little piece of terrain versus maybe working yourself through some of this lower angle and like mellower tree line terrain. You could work the bench below these rib features and then kind of slide up and around and then work through some terrain to get up higher. When you're doing lots of kick turns in one little area, it's really hard on the body because it's not an easy move. and it's slow with your group because everyone is going to have to slow down at every corner that you make. So the less kick turns you can do in terrain, the more efficient you're going to be while you're traveling. So save those like little zipper tracks for only where you need them instead of trying to do it everywhere.
Awesome. Thanks for doing that on the fly, Christine. I know we didn't talk about that in advance,
Yeah,
but
that's okay.
had some questions about folks. Do you want to pull up your last slide
Yeah,
there? And then that way we've got a little something while we open up some questions. So thanks so much, everyone, for asking some questions. And
I got to
I
remember
know
how to
that
do
we
a
were,
stop
someone
share.
was like, we were getting some Zoom tutorial. Isn't there an annotate feature? And then I tried to start it, and then my computer wanted me to open system preferences. And this is all recorded for the future. Isn't that
Yeah.
great? Anyway, all right. So, folks, we do have some questions already lined up, and I'm going to be doing my best to kind of get through all of these. So, if you have questions, go ahead and drop it in the question and answer feature. I'm going to turn my video off so I don't look so perplexed as I'm trying to read all of these. Okay, so I've kind of started to separate some of them. We have a couple snow stability questions right off the bat. So I won't be naming exactly who asked every question because I can't remember every single person's name. But what is the difference between propagation potential and cross slope tension?
So propagation potential and cross slope tension um, are very related to each other. Propagation potential is just simply how, like, what is the likelihood that uh, fracture line can propagate or cross a certain area of terrain. So when we're doing snowpack tests, moving away from probably the most common is the compression test that most people know, and we get into extended column tests or propagation saw tests. This is what we're actually testing here. How likely is it for us to create a fracture that is not only going to fracture right under the load, but across terrain? So when we get that into bigger, when we then take that from a pit and try to put it onto a slope, we're trying to assess then is if I put my load here, am I then going to initiate a fracture that crosses that whole piece of terrain? Cross slope tension has to do with, it's a mixture of propagation potential. So if you have the right kind of avalanche or slab properties, I should say, on a slope that adds tension. So maybe there is a convex feature, or there is kind of this thick to thin happening where ribs and gullies are going through. You can have more like, it's easier to have that cross slope tension happening where the terrain is going to amplify the chances for that propagation to run across the entire piece of terrain.
That's awesome. Thank you for describing that. I think that answered it pretty well.
Yeah,
We did have a
so
question. If you
complicated.
could just quickly show I can't, sorry, I lost the question here, but it said something. Can you just explain the, they call it, the graph, the caution graph on the last slide there?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. So in Canada here, we use like a decision-making tool called the evaluator. And this is part of our avalanche, so AST course decision-making tools. And so there's a second side to this card. And I think I actually have some examples of it when we go into our process, building our process course tomorrow or event tomorrow. But there'd be questions on the other side of this that are going to ask you specifically about the hazard of the day and then about the terrain that you're in. And then you take your score and map yourself on this graph and determine where, if you should be, if you're in simple terrain and the avalanche danger is high, then it's telling you here that you need to use extra caution. And so this is kind of terrain travel advice that it's giving you when you land on certain parts of this graph. And so when you're using normal caution, this is just like your normal everyday things. You're out there, you're looking for signs of avalanches, you've read the avalanche bulletin, you're using good communication within your group, and so on. And then when you get into extra caution, you start using techniques such as maybe spacing out on a slope, skiing something one at a time, and so on. And we do kind of go into this more in tomorrow's event.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we do go into that, which is great. And so if you haven't signed up already, please do. Okay, so we have a couple of snow stability questions to link up. And I just want to kind of throw it out there that we do offer some great know before you go online avalanche courses. There's actually like so many going on right now. So while this is kind of terrain focused, we're happy to answer some snow stability questions and avalanche questions, but we strongly recommend you actually just go take a course. Yeah, take a course or go to, additional actual specific snow stability questions. So, but with that said, we will ask Christine from her brain trust. So this is from Jade. While touring today, my partner and I dug a quick hand pit and noticed a 2-inch thick rain crust with 4 inches of snow on top. How will this affect the snowpack in the future?
So I'm just going to caveat all of these questions as it's hard for me to give you an exact answer on this. Every snowpack answer is going to be it depends. So a rain crust can do two things. It can be a slippery slope or become a slippery surface for layers that fall on top of it. If it froze, like it was really cold and froze hard, or if it was warm when it was freezing, then snow could sometimes stick to that surface. So what you want to be looking for is how is that snow sticking to that surface as you were looking at it in your hand pit today. And then also consider what's happening with the weather as things go on. So if I guess what happens with crust is faceting can happen above and below a crust. And so snow is continually changing within the snowpack. It's not going to be there forever. And that crust will break down eventually. But it also blocks vapor transfer through the snowpack. And this can produce faceting on one side or the other of the crust, which then can create a weak layer right above a crust. And if that crust is a hard sliding surface with a weak layer on it, and then you get a slab of snow on it, that could affect the snowpack negatively. When you're in warmer climates, often we get lots of crusts and the snow just kind of sticks to those crusts. And then as it warms and metamorphosizes, it kind of just all glues together and changes into a nice rounded snowpack. And it goes away. It doesn't become a problem so much. So again, it's going to depend on the weather conditions that happen in the future from what you saw today. So the crust is there now. You're going to continually monitor that crust as the days go on and see if it becomes a problem or not.
Awesome. Yeah, exactly. Just kind of constantly be looking at that weather and assessing what's going on around you is a good way to look at it. Mm-hmm. So kind of a terrain/snow science question, which is interesting. So is there a type of tree or way that snow has formed on or around a tree that you should be particularly worried about for tree well danger? Basically kind of are you always worried about tree well danger? Or are there certain situations where maybe that's not a major concern?
So oddly, the smaller trees can be the bigger tree well danger. So often when you have like a big tree, the branches come down and they make the well around, but the well is so big and obvious that it's pretty easy to ski away from it. But when you have like a little Christmas tree with just the points sticking up, you don't realize actually how tall that tree could be and how loose that snow and unconsolidated that snow is around that tree, especially right at the start of the season when there's no base, or if you just get like a lot of new snow quickly and then it buries these smaller trees. And so those ones can be definitely a lot more dangerous than the really big trees. But tree wells, they are a danger. And so when you're skiing through the trees, you kind of want to think about turning below them instead above them, which you're like, well, how do I know if I'm above or below it? Because you're kind of between trees, but that's what people often say. And then also having that tree well buddy and just doing a good job of like being in contact while you're skiing through the trees is super important.
Awesome. All right, we're going to move along to some more kind of terrain focused questions here. So this question is kind of, I think, definitely going to be an it depends thing. And so again, for whoever answers this, just kind of bear with us in the sense that Christine is amazing, but she does not, she is still a human being.
Yeah, I'm
So
sitting in my bedroom right now. So
if you were in a situation where you only had two choices between a convex roll versus a gully or terrain trap, what would you recommend? Ideally, you would pre-plan out a better route, but as a newbie, I often find myself in a situation where I have to make this choice. I would love your thoughts on how you would assess this and make this choice.
yeah, so you are going to pre-plan for the day, but you're not going to be able to pre-plan every terrain feature that you run into, obviously. Like that's just impossible. And so what you want to ask yourself when you get into these situations is my mentors always put it to me as like, who's the bigger guy in the bar? Because you want to fight the small guy, not the big guy. So I mean, if the size, you want to look at the size of the feature of that convex roll. And then you also want to consider the avalanche problem that you have and the size of avalanche that you're dealing with. So if you're only dealing with size 1 avalanches, um, and the avalanche hazard is low or moderate, and you don't have, and the specific problem is wind slab, and you're like below tree line, I'd probably choose the gully over the convex roll. But this is something that is not black and white. Like you need to be kind of assessing consistently throughout the day, the snow stability. So if you've been skiing or touring and you're noticing that, you know, things are cracking and whumping around you, or you're seeing small avalanches, signs of avalanches and things like that, you want to avoid both of those terrain features. Um, if you're going through that terrain and you're noticing that, you know, none of the convex rolls are really popping, nothing steep is sliding, you know, avalanche danger is low, then maybe you feel better about engaging either of those terrains. And so this is definitely not a question that I can say that you would pick one over the other for, because it would it would depend on the day that you were out there. Um, and then also depend on, how big is this gully too? Like, will I be able to get out of it? Can I cross the gully and go to the other side, or am I going to be stuck in this gully and then kind of in a bad place for a long time as well? So yeah, good question though. It's a tricky one.
It's a tricky one for sure. Okay, we're kind of jumping around here, but how do you, and I think this kind of maybe fits into last night's event. So again, if you missed that, we'll send out an opportunity for you to catch up on that. But how do you manage risk on the up track versus skiing down? Since descending is generally much faster, minimizing duration of exposure and puts less pressure on the snow beneath, can you tackle more risky terrain? How do you use terrain to your advantage for taking breaks/rests?
Okay. Lots of questions in that question. Okay.
Yeah.
So so on the way up, you are definitely more exposed because you're slower. So what you're looking for here is you want to kind of consider the safest terrain. So when you're going to be moving slower through that terrain, just always look for the place where you're going to have the most advantage, right? So I'm going to, again, maybe stay out of gully features. I'm going to use low angle slopes. I'm going to use rib features. I'm going to look for high points in terrain as I'm setting my track. And again, the idea here with your track is that you can use it to explore, and also get an idea of where you might ski down, or you're helping assess snowpack as you just move through terrain. Assessing the snow does not mean that you have to dig a pit. Like just observing what's around you is going to give you a lot of information about what the snow is doing under your feet, falling off trees, rolling down slopes, all that kind of stuff. So just be kind of mindful of that as you're moving through the terrain. Um, and then you can use um, things such as spacing out. You can use things such as avoiding terrain completely. Maybe you're going to move quickly through a piece of terrain. You're going to maybe move one at a time. So those are kind of techniques that you're going to try to do. Sometimes you put a rope on in certain terrain to mitigate a hazard. So you just kind of move as you're moving through, you're asking yourself, what is the hazard and how am I managing it? And if I can't manage it, how do I avoid it or start making a different decision altogether? Like maybe I have to go somewhere else. What was the rest of that question?
I think you said just how to use terrain to your advantage for taking breaks and rest. So
Okay, yeah. So overhead hazard is always the big, if you're going to be hanging out somewhere, you always want to be considering what's above you. So if you're going to rest in a spot, um, don't rest right under it at the bottom of an avalanche path or underneath a big cliff with a big convex like piece of snow hanging above you or something like that. Like look for places where you feel safe, right? So in nice forested areas, on high points, well away from overhead hazard, and always consider the size of avalanche that you're expecting that day. Having a size 1 avalanche is a lot different than expecting a size 3 avalanche as well. So that can play into your decision making.
awesome. Thank you so much, Christine, for answering that. So
Mhm.
this is a kind of a simple, maybe you might have some tricks for this. I know there's a lot of tools you might have in your backpack. Maybe it's a tomorrow night question, but any tips for figuring out the slope angle? I find this is often a challenge to determine how steep things are, especially from afar and from below.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people carry iPhones these days, and there is actually a slope angle measure app in there that you can use. Another good thing that we carry are compasses, and if you're carrying a compass with a mirror, most of them also have a slope angle, not calculator, but well, I'm blanking on the word for it all of a sudden. But basically, you can determine the slope angle with your compass as well. So you would turn the compass so that the east and west are at the top and bottom of your compass, and then there'll be a separate arrow, and you'll flip your compass on the angle, and then you can read the angle of the slope off the compass. And then there's some people who like to do kind of basically where you'd have two ski poles, and you would hold one ski pole perpendicular, sorry, right angle to the slope, and then the other one drop down, and you would calculate in your brain visually the angle that is created there to determine the slope angle. I personally use my compass because it's always with me, and it doesn't run out of batteries. And I just try to guess my slope angle, and then I'd go measure it. And then also, if you do have your phone handy with you and it's got batteries and you're not worried about killing them for whatever reason, then that is also a great tool to use. And then you can buy specific um, slope angle tools, but that's just one more thing to put in your pack, and you're already carrying 3 things with you that you can use to do that. So.
Awesome. We have I can't say it.
Inclinometer, that's the word.
Inclinometer.
Yeah.
I'm tongue tied too. Yeah, that was not
Mhm.
right on the tip of my tongue. We had, a bunch of people all message that to the panelists. Just don't you worry, folks. Everyone in the group knows what the answer is. It's so great. Okay, this was a question from Jillian. Jillian, thanks for your patience. It was one of the first questions asked, but is it common to remotely trigger a slab avalanche at the tension point while traveling in the concave portion of a concave convex roll? Does that make sense to you, Christine? Do you need to visualize the question?
I think she's kind of talking about like toe triggering, like if you're
Right.
underneath the convex roll. So remote triggering, and sometimes we do call this toe triggering if you're below it, um, is a specific problem. Like you need to have the right problems to be able to get this to happen. So you'll have to have a persistent weak layer, so facets or surface hoar or depth hoar in the snowpack. And then you're going to have some sort of cohesive slab on top. And it's probably going to be, um, yeah, so sorry. You'll have the persistent weak layer, which until it's buried is not a problem. And then what happens with those persistent weak layers is they tend to collapse, and they also are very good at connecting terrain. So if you have a persistent weak layer with, let's say, a stiffer slab on top of it, then there's going to be more tension in that snowpack. And when that um, snow collapses, then that cross slope potential goes up, and it is going to be easier for you to toe trigger from below. So when you're looking at the avalanche bulletins, again, take note of those specific terrain feature, or those, sorry, specific avalanche problems, and then consider that. So when I see persistent weak layers, overhead hazard kind of always pops into my head, is like, okay, I need to start thinking about overhead hazard and the potential with the right slab stiffness that I could even maybe trigger a big avalanche from far away. But it doesn't actually have to be a very stiff slab for you to get that remote triggering to happen with the right problem. So it depends.
As many of these questions are, it
Yeah.
depends. And actually, so we've had a couple questions on that first slide you showed, or not first one, the one where you circled where that slab avalanche was. If maybe you can go back to that. We have a couple questions specifically about that. So our first question is
this one, I think.
So, yep, that one. So, and this is, we have a lot of different levels in this course tonight. So if this is a refresher for some of you folks, then let it be a refresher. But we had the question of, on this convexity slide where you circled the avalanche, what makes the skied slope in the shade to the right of the avalanche slope safe? Kind of just pointing out the terrain feature that makes you feel safe about that versus not safe about where the shaded area is.
Yeah, so this is outside Whistler Blackcomb in a very popular place. This is Obo. And this is last year. And so also relates to the question that we had just before this. So this was remote triggered avalanches that we were getting on surface hoar from fairly far away that were actually making these avalanches come down. And a lot of the tracks in here, like, this is just recreational heaven. So tracks in here, I would not go back into this area being brand new and be like, oh, someone skied here, so I can ski here. The reason I chose the pink line here is because it's on supported terrain. So there's no concavities in this feature. There's small planar slopes that are broken up by benches that I can kind of get away from terrain from. I'm not underneath any overhead hazard. If I actually followed some of these ski lines, I'm right underneath another convexity, like just to the lookers. Can you see my mouse when I'm moving it around? Okay, so
we can.
Okay, that makes it easier. So there's another convexity right in here, and a lot of these ski lines come right through it or even over it. And there might actually even be an avalanche in there. I can't quite tell from the photo, but I think that there was. And so a lot of those ski lines go right through that. And so just by even being kind of right here, you're now underneath this feature. Whereas if I'm here, I'm on the high point of terrain. And then as I come down here, it kind of rolls over, and it's hard to tell when you're looking straight on how steep a photo is. But I know, because I also looked at the map in this terrain, that the angle of this slope is actually pretty mellow. And then there's a nice bench feature in here that I can follow out and away that keeps me from rolling over convexities here. And I'm far enough away from the slope here, and I'm going to be moving fast, that I could, and if I was concerned, spread my group out as we moved through this terrain. So that's kind of what I was thinking about when I was looking at that as a safer line to ski.
Awesome. And we actually had a similar follow-up question that was just kind of, she mentioned the ridge crests slide, but she's asking about where you would set the track up on some of these photos. And I know that that's really an it depends thing. And I think if anything, it's more just like how you approach where you track up versus ski down. And that definitely goes into the world of ski mountaineering and all sorts of fun stuff. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I find that looking personally, when I'm doing my pre-planning, which we get a lot into tomorrow, I don't generally look at photos first to determine where I'm going to track up and track down, because when I'm looking at a photo, certain features are going to look a lot steeper than they might be, and certain features are going to look more low angled than they might be. So I want to really actually look at the map and the contour lines to give myself a better uh, understanding of that terrain. But that being said, if I'm looking at this photo, I'm going to try to break it down into the hazards, right? So I've got big steep faces here with cornice on both of these ridges. So overhead hazard right away is a concern in these areas. So if I'm going to put myself underneath these, I want to consider how likely is it for that these cornices to come down, and also if these cornices drop onto these slopes, do I have any sort of avalanche hazards that I am then afraid of causing bigger avalanches to run down far into this bowl down here where I could be trying to up track or something like that. The safest line on here is going to be um, probably on the high points of terrain, right? So maybe I can work something coming up through the treed rib here and getting onto here, and then work up through this zone here. And then from there, can't really tell. Maybe I can wrap around and get right up on top, or maybe this is my high point and I kind of ski back down where I came, or possibly able to sneak into some of this terrain where I'll be moving faster and can kind of space my group out and we move down and get out of the way. Same thing on this side, you could work yourself up the ridge, and then maybe you do want to ski some of the steeper lines in here, and you're going to have to assess the cornice hazard, as well as any other kind of features and avalanche hazard that you have before you drop into a bigger line like this. And this wouldn't be the first one I'd go for, right? I probably would start trying to ski some of these smaller spots, gaining information, digging pits before I start stepping up into the bigger line up here where I'm exposing myself to the most hazard.
Sweet. Do you have any book recommendations with good pictures of these features, or recommendation on reading material for beginners to get a better sense of terrain?
I think the best thing to do with terrain is go out with people who are more experienced than you, so, and that you trust. So that could be friends, that could be hiring a guide and just asking lots of questions. But if you're like looking for the classic reads, probably Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain would be like the next step up to books to go look to. And then um, I can't quite remember the titles, but maybe I can send some to you, Claire, later,
Yeah.
and we can make that available.
Yeah, for sure. We have some recommended reading that we usually send out for Alpine Finishing School attendees, and some of that, I think that Margaret Wheeler book. There's a lot of resources out there.
Exactly.
Sure.
But the reality is you're going to get the most out of actually like looking at maps, looking at photos, making up a decision, like making up your mind beforehand of what you think terrain looks like, and before you even get into it, and then going out, seeing it, and then going back and be like, oh, did that relate to what I thought? And then, talking to people who have more experience than you do.
Awesome. This question is kind of similar, and I think I can actually just kind of head it off. Emily, you asked, is there a good resource to research and find ski tour routes? The internet is full of opinions and info. It's hard to filter. And I'll let Christine pile on, but I kind of think it's more of like a building a lot of different small skill sets. And then, you're not going to just like be able to have someone tell you on the internet exactly how to do the ski tour perfectly. I think what do you think, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great guidebooks out there for certain areas that maybe are popular. And even in those, you need to take their information with a grain of salt, because their recommended track might not be perfect for every day. So I go to multiple resources when I'm going somewhere that I haven't been before, or I'm trying to plan something bigger. I'll look at trip reports, I'll look at guidebooks, and then, but a lot of it is my own pre-planning, of looking at maps and Google Earth and Gaia and different kind of things like that as well, and kind of layering other people's recommended routes and what it looks like the terrain looks like to me. And then when I'm out there, reassessing all of it and being like, is this actually making sense? And does the plan still work with what I'm actually seeing when I'm in terrain? Which we talk about a lot tomorrow.
Perfect. Yeah, I think
Perfect.
a lot of the questions here tomorrow, I know we have about 10 minutes left. So we're gonna try to get through a couple of these questions. If your question doesn't get answered, there's a chance that we're gonna probably cover it tomorrow. And then we're talking about doing a totally follow-up Q&A event where you would be able to submit questions ahead of time. Just so stay tuned on that because we're getting a lot of questions here and wanting to make sure we have time to cover them all. So all right, our next question is, how could you tell the terrain was glaciated? And I think that that's probably just a bit different for depending on where you are in the country. Because we had showed some photos that showed and we said, oh, this is glaciated. So do you have any of those pulled up that you could pull up?
Yeah, I think those were some of your pictures, but maybe some of mine too. But let's see here. I recognize some of the photos and just know that that's glaciated terrain because I've been there or whatever. But also, let's see here. Um, oh, that was it. Oh, go back there. Okay, so this is glaciated terrain in here. It's alpine. I know it's a glacier, but often things like a lot of these like little rolls and ribs and stuff like this may not actually be ice anymore depending on where the glacier is, but at some point ice has run over this and created this type of terrain feature, this like convoluted kind of like ups and downs and bumps and whatever throughout the terrain. And then as we come farther up into the picture here, we see what we call kind of slots or sags in this terrain. These are crevasses and ice fall as we get lower down here, and they're covered in snow, some of them, but some of them are probably, if we were really there, you would actually see ice in those places. So it's a bit of experience of just like knowing what glaciated terrain looks like and being able to kind of understand that maybe there's not ice there necessarily, but that glaciers have run through here, and that's going to add complications to that terrain because often it is kind of roly-poly and has then different aspects and angles and convexities and little gully features in between all of these kind of moraine features as you move through. And then the other side is if you're not sure, then this is part of your pre-planning. So looking at your maps and photos and such before you head out and knowing where that glaciated terrain is.
All right, thanks, Christine. A couple more questions we're going to sneak in here. So if you're traveling over a buried wind slab that you're aware of, I guess is what the question means, and we're particularly worried about them that day, what techniques would you use to identify the slab and what risk it could pose?
Yeah,
I
so
think he means
yeah.
terrain, yeah.
Yeah, so buried wind slab is going to be harder to notice on the surface because it's not right on top. But if it's been like quite windy and wind slabs are getting buried, one technique that I often use is I'll flip my pull over so that the basket's in the air and the handle isn't, and I'll push my pull down into the snow and just be looking for different resistances in the snow. And what I'm really wary of is like kind of stiff resistance, and then all of a sudden it like quickly like drops in the snowpack, and that's telling me that there's some sort of change in resistance, and a big change in resistance where it's like stiff, 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 and then it drops down suddenly is usually not a good thing. Um, Again, you're going to be looking for shooting cracks, hollow sounds, whomping, that sort of thing as you're moving through that terrain. And often, if you do have wind slab on top of the snow, it does tend to form in the same places. So there could be buried wind slab under. So you could go into kind of a place where maybe the snow has been wind affected and it's low angle or just a very tiny feature, and you could dig into the snow in that area and do some pit tests, or just even at least see the layering in the snowpack and kind of start gaining some understanding that way.
Are there any conditions that make riding over a convexity okay? Or are you always trying to avoid convexities beyond a certain size?
Um, so this is again an it depends question. When we're at the ski hill, convexities, like we love to like go and ride, you know, fast, and then you hit the rollers and take air, and unfortunately in the backcountry we have to like change our thought on how we ski or ride because the consequences are much higher, obviously, if something goes wrong. So generally speaking, yes, I'm avoiding convexities, especially big convexities, but little small pillows, that kind of thing, in the right terrain. It's not saying that you can't do that, but if you're out there and you're seeing obvious signs of instability, then you do want to avoid those. So it all comes down to the observations that you're making as you move through terrain and understanding these terrain shapes and how they sometimes can help you and sometimes they don't, and knowing that, then it's ultimately your decision on what you do with that. I'm not like, there's not a yes or no answer to that, unfortunately.
What are the protocols for setting your tracks with consideration for preserving lines to ride down? But maybe add on to that, maybe how can you set your tracks to help you with your
Mhm.
descent? Maybe
Yeah,
too.
yeah. So there's not necessarily a protocol for preserving your lines to ride down, or for other people. I use my track in all sorts of ways. So sometimes I'll use it to specifically mark exactly where I'm going to ride down. And then when I get to the top, I ride down through my track that I set up because I know that that is the safest place to go because I've walked up it. So, if I find myself in a hazardous situation or something like that. Maybe I'm in glaciated terrain and I want to make sure that I'm not going into a crevasse or something, then that's where I might do something like that. Other times I use my track to explore the terrain, and look for the best riding or seek out lines and maybe use it as a marker. Like if I'm gonna, like, okay, I want to make sure that I ride down and hit the corner of my track here and know that I want to just be to the right of my track from then on, or something like that. um yeah, and so again, too, sometimes your track is used just to find information on the snowpack that you're heading into. So sometimes maybe it's out of the way, but I'll specifically go search out an aspect and type of feature that's going to relate to something that I want to ride, um, to gain information on that snow that I can hopefully relate to the piece of terrain that I'm heading for.
All right. For those of us in the PNW BC area, what are the most common concerns you look out for? I guess that means maybe with terrain traps features. I'm not sure. Maybe snow stability.
Yeah, I mean, the terrain features are going to be everywhere. So if we're talking about hazard, um, in the PNW kind of coastal snowpack, generally speaking, our big hazard here is storm slab. We get big storms and we'll have a lot of snow to deal with, and that storm slab could be a problem from anywhere from 24 hours to maybe a couple days, depending on how warm things are. And you'll be monitoring that. Lately, though, we've been seeing a change in weather patterns and we've been getting more and more surface hoar out in these areas. And so I think it's really important that you watch out for that, and do not get complacent with your normal kind of terrain use practices, because out on the coast, or in the PNW, our snowpack, it's deep, it tends to be warmer, and overall tends to be what we consider a little more stable than, like, somewhere colder, like a rocky snowpack or even an interior snowpack. Um, so oftentimes we get away with things out here that maybe you wouldn't get away in those places. And now we're seeing these kind of surface horn facet problems, like we had last year here in Whistler, that really surprised people. So just again, it's about going to the bulletin and understanding what you're reading in the bulletin, and taking that to the train. Generally speaking, though, we often are dealing with storm slab here as our biggest hazard.
Well, I think we are almost at time. There's
Mhm.
definitely a couple more questions. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get to all of them. Cynthia asked, are there general tips for navigating a whiteout that comes up quick? Or does this really just come down to experience? What's the best way to get that experience?
Yeah, that one we're definitely, yeah, this comes down to pre-planning in a whiteout. And so
Right.
we go over that tomorrow for sure. Um, yeah, like a lot of a lot of this stuff that I'm seeing in here is kind of pre-planning. Let's see here.
I think so. Yeah.
We're comfortable with versus consistent storm weather. This one here, can you describe a melt freeze cycle that you might be more comfortable with versus consistent storm weather that poses high AVI risk? Um, I'm not quite even sure. Sorry, maybe this wasn't a great example, but like a melt freeze cycle, this is like when we get into freeze thaw in the springtime. So you're going to want to use the frozen times to travel through your more hazardous terrain and be out of that kind of hazardous terrain once it starts to thaw. Um, I don't know that you might be more comfortable with that versus a consistent storm weather posing high AVI dangers, because in a melt freeze cycle, it's swinging and you have to be catching that at the right time and being very aware of when that timing is changing to it's totally okay for me to be here and all of a sudden now it's no longer okay for me to be here versus consistent stormy weather. You kind of just know, well, I've got high AVI risk. I just know that I shouldn't be in certain terrain. Until that avalanche danger comes down, I don't have to really make any hard decisions in that terrain. I just avoid it. And then
Hey,
our
this one
terms
from
translate
Jade.
may be interchangeable.
Oh
Yes.
yeah, those. Yeah,
Yes.
go for that
Those
one.
are.
Yes, the terms
Yes.
are.
Yeah.
Last question, Jade Butler, and I think this one does really relate to terrain. Why is it safer, theoretically, she wrote safer in quote
Mhm.
air quotes, to ski a couloir than a gully?
It's not. A couloir and a gully are the same thing. It's just on different scales. A couloir, when we talk about a couloir, it tends to be narrower and thin, and a gully tends to be larger and wider. But a couloir um, also is a terrain trap. It has steep sidewalls that you can't exit. It funnels snow down it, and it's an avalanche. Often what happens with a couloir is that they're steeper, so they slough out more often. So sometimes avalanche danger can be less in them because you're already in the start zones and they don't have snow left. But they're the same type of feature. So they're not, they're a terrain trap is basically what it comes down to. But couloirs, I guess, also tend to be, when we think of a couloir, we think of them in alpine terrain, and they probably have like an end point, whereas a gully feature could run top to bottom. Um, so it comes down to management, and yeah, I don't know if safer is the right word. It's just like understanding that you're putting yourself in that terrain and the hazards associated with it. You can ski gully features as well. You just need to understand that you're in a terrain trap, and so there may be times when it's not appropriate to ski those features, especially narrow confined ones. And if you happen in a couloir, often we're dealing with wind slab or storm slab in those places, and um, depending on if you came from the bottom or came from the top, you may or may not know that going in, or you may surprise yourself climbing up it and hitting something like that. So there's lots of different problems that can happen with couloirs. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Rabbit
depends.
hole.
Again, we're
It depends. Yeah.
our favorite phrase.
Yeah.
It depends. Okay, folks, we are at time, and so if your question didn't get answered, I've flagged it. I'll try to bring it forward for tomorrow. I think that a lot of these that are remaining really relate back to what we're going to cover tomorrow. If you haven't registered for that yet, you can do so at Eventbrite or go to shejumps.org/events. And we'll be sending out information for how to access the first night's presentation as well. So thank you so much, Christine. If anyone else, yeah, now you know now you know everything you need to know about terrain. Kind of, it depends. You need to just keep digging and getting experience. But that's what we're all here for.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Claire. And thanks for everyone for tuning in again tonight. And yeah, sorry we didn't have a chance to get to all the questions. But there's lots of great resources out there, especially I've saw a few of them about kind of more snow science aspects, which wasn't really what this night was about. So there's lots of reading you can do on that stuff if you really want to get into the specifics of temperature and snow and that kind of stuff.
Yes, we also, SheJumps is offering a backcountry 101. We have several know before you go avalanche awareness events coming up. So we really recommend that you dig in on the avalanche side of things. Terrain is just one piece of a larger puzzle about managing all those hazards.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody.